This lab is going to be involving the brain, the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and cranial nerves. Again, we're going to keep it as simple as possible, just for the sake of having a truncated lab period and making sure that we understand everything. The first structure that I want you to recognize, of course, is the brain. This would be a lateral aspect of the brain, or the picture of the brain from the side. In this picture, they sort of have a translucency where you can sort of see directly to the center. Now, this picture here shows the four parts of the brain, the four main parts of the human brain. The cerebral hemispheres, or just the cerebrum, would be the first and massively largest part of the brain. About 80% of the brain's mass is in the cerebrum. In the center of all of that is the diencephalon. Inferior to all of this would be the brainstem. And then towards the posterior, infero-posterior area would be the cerebellum. So again, the four different parts of the brain: the cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. A lot of times we engage with the lobes of the brain: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and then these sulci are not usually something that I engage with too much. But what we're looking at in the specific names of the sulci, don't worry about too much. But all these little lines that you see here are called sulci, or a singular would be a sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S. Plural would be sulci, S-U-L-C-I. Now you'll notice there's a central sulcus that sort of divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. However, in a brain, like an actual human brain, it would actually be really hard to find the central sulcus, and in a brain model, it's the same. Oftentimes, the central sulcus is not completely obvious, so don't worry about that so much. But just understand that all of these little lines are sulci. There is another lobe, by the way, inside of all of this. If you open up this lateral fissure here, you'd be able to see through there. And there's another lobe that's kind of deep to all of this, which is called the insula. I noticed that it is not named here in this picture, so don't worry about it too much. Just make sure you know these four lobes that I pointed out. Now, what we're looking at here is a mid-sagittal slice of the brain. We've taken a slice down what's called the longitudinal fissure. Now, a fissure is quite deep. A fissure is sort of a sulcus, which is very, very deep and kind of really dives into the brain. So in this picture, you can actually see the sulci, right, on the outside here. And these parts that stick up, what we would call the ridges sticking up, would be the gyri, or gyrus for singular. So gyrus and sulcus. So in this view, you can really see those very well. You can see the gyri sticking up and the sulci dipping in. Anyway, the slice that we're looking at here is down a fissure, which is much deeper than an actual sulcus. The longitudinal fissure basically is a mid-sagittal slice along the brain, and it's a really obvious way to slice a brain. And when we do so, we actually see quite a lot of the really interesting material inside of the brain, a lot of the interesting structures that you're able to easily identify in a brain model, for example. So this would be a really useful perspective. You can spend some time looking at the outside of the brain, but if you really want to know what's going on inside of the brain, you're going to be wanting to look at a slice like this. All right, so let's start with the cerebrum up above. As we pointed out, it is this massive structure of the brain, the cerebrum. There is a structure of white matter that is called the corpus callosum. So much of what you're going to be looking at and seeing in the brain is going to be gray matter, because the gray matter tends to be more superficial. The white matter tends to be deeper. Now, the gray matter is made of somata, or cell bodies, and dendrites. The white matter is made of axons. So when you see something like the corpus callosum, what it actually is axons that are myelinated. That's why it appears to be white. And in this case, the corpus callosum actually unites the two halves of the brain. Those cerebral hemispheres, the left side of the brain from the right side of the brain, it's actually connected at the corpus callosum. And so what the corpus callosum actually is are millions of axons that are shooting back and forth from one side to the other. And normally when we do a mid-sagittal sectioning of the brain, we slice right through that corpus callosum. All right, in this picture, we also want to take a look at this area of the brain, which would be called the thalamus. Now, this would be part of the diencephalon. You can see that it's kind of labeled on the side here. The diencephalon includes the thalamus, epithalamus, pineal gland, and the hypothalamus. So go ahead and find all of those structures. So in the diencephalon, we have the thalamus, epithalamus, pineal gland, hypothalamus. And then down underneath of here, the hypothalamus is actually this sort of W shape. Do you see the W here? You can usually also find the W in a model. So look for the W. That area right in there is going to be the hypothalamus right in here. Just inferior to the hypothalamus, you have a stalk called an infundibulum. And at the end of the stalk is the pituitary gland. Now, technically, the infundibulum and the pituitary gland are not part of the actual brain. They are inferior to the brain, but they are attached directly to the hypothalamus. A lot of times our models are going to be missing these two structures, so just be aware of that. All right, so those are the structures of the diencephalon you want to get to know, that the hypothalamus probably being the one that's the most obvious and apparent because of that W shape. Let's take a look at the brainstem. So the brainstem is inferior to most structures of the brain and kind of posterior to the pituitary gland, if you will. The brainstem is made of the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. And just inferior to that is going to be your spinal cord. So one of the ways you can find these structures is actually to find the spinal cord first and then make your way up the spinal cord. And the very first kind of very subtle protrusion is going to be the medulla. In models, the pons really does tend to have like kind of this egg appearance, sort of like an oval, very obvious, and just superior to that would be the midbrain. Let's take a look at the cerebellum. The cerebellum back here has gray matter and white matter, and the white matter of the cerebellum is going to be called the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. You can see how pretty it is. It really does look very much like a tree.